Welcome back, everybody. Hope everyone's doing well. Welcome into another edition of my roster review series with a look into the BC Lions. And as we get closer to the start of this season, the roster pictures for all these teams are becoming much more clear. So as we get further along in this series, we only have one more video to go after this. We actually have a much more clear idea of what the back end of these rosters are starting to look like. So we'll talk more about that in this video. So first, we'll start off, like always, talking about the positional rankings, where every position ranks relative to the rest of the league. And then we'll go into the projected starters / ratio possibilities, where this team's going to start their Canadians this season. And then we'll go into the award predictions, most outstanding player, most outstanding Canadian, that kind of thing. And then we'll go into my final thoughts about the team going into this season. And as a reminder, once again, timestamps in the description. If you want to watch a certain part of the video, there you go. So we'll start with the quarterback position, which is going to rank second in the CFL. And like I've talked about for a while in this series, it's very hard to rank the CFL quarterbacks this year. There's a big difference in terms of how the players are going to perform after so much time off. And so it's all about trust for me. And I do trust Michael Riley, not Mike Riley, who's going by Michael now because of the passing of his mother. And that's how she always referred to him. So he's going by Michael. But Michael Riley, I really do trust him as a quarterback. He's proved himself throughout his CFL career, been a very consistent starter, very tough guy, can take a lot of hits. And we really did see that in 2019 when he signed a big contract with BC and had probably the worst season of his career, other than maybe his first year as a starter. But a lot of that was due to factors outside of his control. I really do expect for him to bounce back this season. I think, as we'll talk about in a bit, the supporting cast is a lot better than it was in 2019, at least on the offensive side of the ball. So Michael Riley, really the prototypical CFL quarterback. He can do a bit of everything. He has a big arm, one of the best arms in the CFL. He has the mind to pick apart the defense. He also has the scrambling ability. He's very effective at picking his spots to run for first down. So I very much have faith in Michael Riley to be that franchise quarterback that BC thought they were signing in 2019 free agency. Now moving on to Nathan Rourke, the Canadian backup here, and I'm just really excited that he won the BC Lions backup quarterback job. I thought that Will Arndt, who had CFL experience, was going to beat him out for that number 2 job, but they released Arndt this week. Rourke, who comes in out of the University of Ohio, one of the most hyped Canadian quarterbacks in recent memory, wins the backup job here and is going to have really great opportunity for the tutelage of Riley, learning from him. And I'm really excited to see what he can do going into the future here as a potential guy to break this Canadian quarterback curse in the CFL. And then you got Shea Patterson, who was a former 5-star recruit. He attended Ole Miss before transferring to Michigan for his final 2 years. He spent 2020 in the Spring League and has parlayed that into a contract with the Lions. So we'll see how he does here, but it appears that he's made the roster as the 3rd quarterback here. Overall, this is all about Mike Riley, him as an established quarterback. That's why I have them at 2nd overall in the CFL. Now, running back, they're going to rank 7th in the CFL, and this is mostly just an experience issue. I do think they have talent. And we'll start with Shaq Cooper, who has a lot of talent. I think he's shown a lot of explosiveness in the few carries that he's had in the CFL with Edmonton. And now he comes over to BC here. I was kind of shocked that Edmonton didn't retain him. But BC with a good pickup here, who I think has the potential to be a ceiling raiser for this offense. He has that explosive running ability. He's very much an elusive back rather than a power back. And he really showcased an ability to be a good receiver out of the backfield and limited opportunities with Edmonton last season. So really excited to see what he can do for this offense. And then behind him, you have the veteran Chris Rainey, who's never really been that every down running back in the CFL. He's pretty good at just being that backup guy, but he's also an excellent kick returner. So that's why he's on the roster here. And then you have Jamel Lyles, a Canadian runner, an 8th round pick in 2019, got a few carries as a rookie, but mostly featured on special teams. He did look explosive in the 12 or so carries that he did get, so take that for what it's worth in that small sample size, but we'll see what he can do here in year 2. And then James Butler, he returns to the CFL after a training camp stint with the Riders in 2019, and in between that, he played with the XFL's Houston Roughnecks as the team's starting running back and was actually very productive down there. So we'll see if he's the guy that actually takes hold of this running back job at some point this season. You also have David Mackey, who's more of that fullback type, going to contribute on special teams, not really a threat to carry the ball. But overall, I think the reason why it's just dragged down is because we haven't really seen any of these guys be the guy that, can take 12 to 15 carries, whatever you want to call it, your workload for an ideal running back. We haven't seen that from these players here. So that's the reason why it ranks 7th in the CFL. But I do think Shaq Cooper has a lot of potential, and you do have some interesting players here like James Butler. Now moving on to the wide receiver room, and I'm going to say it right now, I really like this wide receiver room. It's going to rank 3rd in the CFL. And we'll start with Brian Burnham, who I've said it a couple times in videos. I think there's 3 guys really in the conversation for best receiver in the CFL based off what we've seen over the past few years. So Burnham is absolutely in that conversation. He can do it all. He's had these highlight reel catches, but he's also just such a fundamental receiver. He runs good routes, can get open in every area of the field, a very good after the catch threat as well. Just an overall dynamic player for this offense and probably the best player on this team. And then you have Lamar Durant, a really good Canadian receiver, had his best season in 2019, and I think he could have his first 1,000-yard season this season as well. A very good, well-rounded guy that has the athletic ability to be a plus receiver in this offense. And then Dominic Grimes, a guy that they signed in the 2020 free agency class from Ottawa. He's going to play that big outside perimeter receiver role and win contested matchups for this offense. And that's the type of receiver that they were really missing in 2019. And I thought that was just a really good add for BC. And then Shaq Johnson, another really good Canadian receiver in this receiving corps. So they're going to start 2 receivers, I think, for sure. Shaq Johnson, a guy that really provides a lot of upside for a guy that's the 4th receiver in this offense. Can run a 4.3 40, just an explosive player. I'm really excited to see if he's a guy that has a big jump in his production this season. Maybe he becomes the dominant Canadian receiver in this offense over Lamar Durant. I doubt it, but I think Shaq Johnson is in for a good season, and I think he's one of the more underutilized receivers in the league. And then you have Lucky Whitehead, who comes over from Winnipeg. I think the whole idea with him signing in BC was to become more of a role as a receiver rather than a return man. That's basically what he's been known as throughout his entire career, going back to his time in the NFL with the Dallas Cowboys. So I'm interested to see if he's worked on his route running and just the fundamentals of playing the role of receiver. But I think regardless, there are ways to use him in this offense, some jet sweep action, some routes that, get him the ball in space and let him take advantage of his abilities that he shows as a kick returner on the offensive side of the ball. We've seen this across the CFL over the past few years with guys that are primarily return guys, learning the position of receiver, the play callers easing them into it with concepts that are comfortable to these players that don't necessarily run the most complex route trees. So I'm interested to see what Whitehead does in this BC offense. And then Javon Catoy, a really interesting 3rd Canadian receiver in this offense. He actually did start some games in 2019. So there were times that BC was actually starting 3 receivers that season. Catoy's a guy that has a lot of potential, but he's very raw, doesn't run a lot of different routes, just not a very refined receiver. But he did get a lot of workouts down south because he has that raw ability. I'm interested to see what he does this season, but I don't know if there's much of a role for him in this offense. Maybe they do start the 3 Canadian wide receivers again and go that route, but I doubt it with the ratio situation we'll talk about in a bit. And then you got a bunch of guys that they brought in here that are relatively new to the CFL. So starting with Alex Wesley, he's one of the most accomplished receivers in Northern Colorado history, while also being a former track star. So we'll watch out for that, see if that athleticism flashes. And then Jake Boshever attended a little-known school called Long Island University and isn't overly fast or a big guy. So I'm interested to see what he brings to the table and what the Lions see in him. And then Keon Hatcher out of Arkansas has exactly 1 career NFL reception and has been on and off of practice rosters for the past couple of seasons. And then Cordell Hastings, a Canadian receiver, was a 5th-round pick out of Acadia in 2020, eager to make his CFL debut this season. Jacob Scarfoni, another Canadian receiver, been a fringe player in the league for the past few seasons with the Red Blacks, likely a special teamer for this team, but we'll see. So really good receiving group for the Lions. Don't really have many questions about it. You got some Canadian components. You got 2 really, really good receivers in Rhymes and Burnham, especially Burnham, who's just, like I said, in the conversation for the best receiver in the entire league. Really do like this receiving core, and I think it's one of the core strengths of this team. Now, on the offensive line, they're going to rank 6th, and this is the position that was the most criticized for this unit in 2019. Obviously, this was the biggest reason why they struggled so much. And they do make some tweaks, and we'll talk about one big addition that they made, but I'm still skeptical in ways about how this unit's going to perform, mostly based on the interior of the line, which really did struggle a lot in 2019. Not just the tackles, but the interior of the line really struggled in 2019. But the highlight of the unit in 2019, if you can call it that, was Joel Figueroa, the veteran tackle. Has been a plus starter at tackle in the CFL throughout his career, but I don't think 2019 was one of his better seasons. He had his fair share of really bad games where he gave up high pressure totals and whatnot. So we'll see how he does, but I don't think he's their biggest problem here. He'll probably play that left tackle role like he usually does. And then Riker Matthews was their big offseason addition I'm talking about. He comes over from Hamilton, and I'm kind of split on Riker Matthews because he actually had a pretty good season with Hamilton in 2019, was a pretty effective left tackle for them. But the lasting memory I have of him is him getting just toasted by Willie Jefferson time and time again in the Grey Cup. Was probably the biggest reason why Hamilton let the game slip away from them so quickly in that game, was because they were just getting toasted on the edge, and Riker Matthews was the guy that was responsible for blocking Willie Jefferson on many of those plays. So I think he's a really good tackle, but I also don't think he's one of the better players in the league at the position. I think he's a very solid starter for this unit, and they will definitely get better with him being the opposite tackle of Figueroa. So I'm very interested to see how that tackle duo works out, but I think it's passable at the CFL level. But on the inside, I have the question. So Suk Chung has been a CFL All-Star before, I believe, been a very good player when he was with Winnipeg, but he signs a massive contract by CFL standards with BC in 2019 free agency, and he only plays 5 games in his first season with the team, and he looked bad in a lot of games that he did see. You could still see the good qualities were there, but there were certain problems in pass protections that I just couldn't ignore when I was looking at film of that season. So very interested to see how he does. Probably still this unit's best Canadian starter, playing at the right guard position. I think it's not possible for him to play any worse than he did in 2019, but we need to see that bounce back for them to raise the ceiling of this unit. And then Hunter Stewart, a guy that's been with this organization for many years, not really a plus starter, maybe a slightly below average starter at the CFL level, but you know what you're getting from him. He's just nothing special really as a player. He's not going to provide a lot of push on the inside, but he provides a little versatility. He can play a little guard. He can move to center a little bit. So I'm interested to see how he does bouncing back this season. He's another guy that had a horrible 2019, but I'm giving them a clean slate going into this season. Peter Godber, another guy that desperately needs a breakthrough this season, was a high pick coming out in the CFL draft, but has never really established himself as a full-time CFL starting offensive lineman. He's had some injury issues. He had a pretty serious injury, I believe, in 2018, so if that really affected his 2019 performance. So it's really a make or break year for Godber. Really interested to see how he does. David Neville, a guy that started a couple games at tackle late in the 2019 season. Interesting guy. Every time you see a Canadian start at tackle, it's always interesting because it's not as common as seeing the Canadian start on the interior. So we'll see how he does going into the future here. I think he's a guy that they're looking to develop at that tackle spot when Figueroa or Matthews goes out the door here. So those guys I'm pretty confident are the main 6 that they're building around. But then you have all these other guys. So Andrew Pearson, a guy that has appeared in just 6 career games going into his 3rd season now in 2021. So not much there to look at throughout his CFL career so far, but maybe there's a breakthrough in store. And then Jarrell Broxton, an offensive guard out of Baylor, who has spent time in both the NFL and the Arena League. Maybe they start 3 American offensive linemen. It's possible, and maybe he's the option there. And then Kent Perkins, a former Texas Longhorn who most recently played for the St. Louis Battlehawks of the XFL. Another guy who has played a prototypical role at guard, so probably not a tackle option for this group. So maybe he slots in as an American offensive lineman on the interior. We'll see. And then you have a few late round picks from the past couple CFL drafts in Tyler Packer and Matt Gouvermont. Packer coming out of Calgary in 2021, selected in the 6th round, and then Gouvermont, a 5th round pick in the 2020 draft. So we'll see if those guys provide any value in the late rounds. So I do have a lot of questions about this offensive line, but then again, the reason why it ranks 6th is because I have a lot of questions about other offensive lines as we've seen throughout this series. I don't think it's the worst because they actually have 2 quality starting tackles, but that interior of that line I have a lot of questions about. Now on the defensive line, this is where it's going to get ugly for BC. They're going to rank 9th in the CFL, and the reason for this is mostly the interior guys, but you also have guys on the edge that I don't think are necessarily number 1 kind of pass rushers. So we'll start with J.R. Tavai, a really good high effort guy that I've been very high on, but I don't necessarily think I'm that high on that I think he's capable of being the number 1 pass rusher for a CFL team. He played in Ottawa over the past couple of years, been a very good energy guy for that defense, will provide a lot of backside pursuit on running plays, just that kind of guy that is always giving it his all, but I don't think he's necessarily that physically talented, so I don't think he's necessarily capable of being that number 1 guy. Chris Kasher, a guy that's kind of gets bullied around in the run game a little bit, but pretty good pass rusher on the edge there. So you have a decent tandem there on the edge, but I don't think that they're necessarily stars here that will raise the ceiling of this defensive line. But on the interior is where you have a lot of question marks, and basically these are all question marks. So I had to do my homework for this one. I'm just going to roll off all these names and tell you a bit about each player because these are all guys that basically have no CFL experience. So Josh Banks, been out of the football since 2018 when he was cut by the New York Giants. We'll see. And then Afumba Kumalu, a guy that's a former Miami Hurricane, comes to the CFL at a relatively older age of 28 after seeing brief game action in the NFL since 2016. So we'll see. There's not much to go off of there. And then Kevin Thurman going undrafted in the 2020 NFL draft. This contract with BC is really his first in professional football. I list those guys first, mostly just because they are listed as defensive tackles on the BC Lions roster website there. And then Court Hammond and Alfred Green, 2 guys that are mid-round picks in the most recent CFL draft. They're coming in as rookies. We'll see what they do. Not much Canadian depth, as you can see. Those guys are the lone Canadians on the roster in the defensive line position. They did take Daniel Joseph in the 1st round this year, but he's not coming over this year. We'll see what they do with the Canadian portion of this defensive line, but there's just not much here. And then Nicholas Gustav, a German that they picked up in the global draft this year. We'll see if he's the global guy that sticks around for this unit. And then Tim Bonner, the first real taste of pro football for him after only attending minicamp in the NFL. Complete question mark. Aboom Gwacham, a 30-year-old CFL rookie. He most recently played in the XFL with the Tampa Bay Vipers, so we'll see what he does, but at least he has some recent film on him. And then Dana Levine Jr. played for Temple University and went undrafted in the NFL. One thing I will say is that a lot of good CFL players have come out of Temple recently, such as Derek Dennis. So overall, this defensive line just has a lot of questions. I think they're going to be pretty bad against the run like they were in 2019. I don't think those ends are going to be very good against the run at all, especially Kasher. But I think they'll be able to rush the passer a little bit on the edge. But like I said, I don't think the ceiling's all too high unless there's a massive breakthrough star in this unit, which you never know in the CFL. At the linebacker position, they're going to rank 8th in the CFL. And there's a lot of players I do like in this unit. As you'll see in a minute, I'm pretty biased towards one player on this unit for a particular reason. But I think there's just a lot of inexperience. I don't think any of these guys really have proven themselves, except for Anthony Chaffee, as good CFL players. So Anthony Chaffee is the strong side linebacker for this unit, presumably, but had his moments of mistakes with the Ottawa Red Blacks in 2019. Though he was good enough to receive an NFL contract, didn't make a team down there, so he comes back and was a really good signing for BC to plug into that strong side linebacker role. And then Isaiah Gazilek-Messam, a guy that I'm pretty biased towards because he actually went to my high school and I played with his brother in high school. So he's a guy that over his first couple CFL seasons has actually broken into the starting lineup. And I don't really know exactly where to place him in this unit, because he may be better as a safety, but I don't necessarily see them starting him at safety. So we'll see what happens with him, but the same really could be said with Bo Lacombo, who Montreal played a bit at safety, but He's also a fit at linebacker as well. So we'll see the position fluidity of this group between the linebackers and the defensive backs. There are a lot of questions similar to what there are on the defensive line, but what you do see in this unit is that there are a lot of Canadians. I think they're going to start 2 Canadian linebackers this season, and I think one of them is going to be Jordan Williams, who was the first pick in the 2020 CFL draft out of East Carolina. Really explosive guy, ran a really fast 40-yard dash, stat sheet stuffer while in college. So it was kind of a lucky thing that BC was able to get him. He was kind of a late entrant to the draft. One of those guys that was able to obtain eligibility for the draft and entered last minute, and he was able to be drafted number 1 overall. And I think he's going to be a starter from day one in the CFL. I think they're really anxious to see him on the field because he's not necessarily the type of athlete that you usually get at the top of the CFL draft each year. So I'm really excited to see his debut. And then Ben Laddick, a guy that fell in the CFL draft this year, but I was super high on, and a lot of people I know were super high on him. Really explosive linebacker out of UBC, but fell in the draft for probably some technical reasons with his positioning or such. We'll see what happens with him in the CFL, but I think at the very least he's going to be a pretty good special teams player right off the bat in the CFL because of his athleticism. And then Deshaun Davis, a guy that is a good CFL vet that provides a little experience as a backup and contributes as a special teamer. So that's always something that's going to appeal to coaches at the CFL level. Beyond that, you have Adam Konar. Don't expect much of him other than special teams ability. Is probably a backup here. And then Damian Jameson was an 8th round pick in the 2021 CFL draft. But overall, just a pretty inexperienced unit. I don't think there's necessarily a star in this unit, and that's why it's kind of dragged down among the other linebacking groups in the league. Now we'll move on to the defensive back room, and I'm really high on this defensive back room. They're going to rank 2nd in the CFL, and the reason for this is because of their mix of experience and star power, and I think they have the best trio, arguably, of defensive backs in the entire CFL with TJ Lee, Gary Peters, and Marcus Sales. Lee and Peters have been here for a while. They actually played really well in 2019 despite this team's major struggles, and I think Lee in particular is just such a really good coverage player, can do a little bit of everything, really sticky in man coverage, but also is very instinctive in zone coverage, so I'm really high on him. And then Gary Peters, just a ball hawk as a corner, just really, really smart player. Maybe gives up a play here or there, but you live with it because he creates plays and takes the ball away for your defense. And then Marcus Sales, who had an excellent 2019 season with Winnipeg, was enough to get a contract in the NFL. Didn't make it down there, but instead of going back to Winnipeg, he signs in BC when he comes back to the CFL, and I think it's a really good addition here. He's a really rangy player back there in the secondary, but is also capable of coming down and playing physical near the line of scrimmage. One thing I noticed with him is he's always attacking the ball and going for that strip, and I really like players that are trying to create takeaways, and that's a lot of the time how you win games in football, is winning that turnover battle. And I think BC has a really good chance at winning the turnover battle a lot of the times this season because they have these sticky defensive backs that are also opportunistic. Victor Gamboa, a guy that broke into the starting lineup a lot of the time last season, I have a lot of confidence in him because he did look good in the situations that he did see. Not a problem with him starting in this defense. And then Anthony Thompson, a veteran Canadian here, been out of the lineup due to the ratio situation in BC over the past few years, but a really good, solid Canadian to have on the roster here and a decent starting option for this group, maybe at safety. And then O'Shane Samuels, a Canadian guy that hasn't seen too much action, mostly been a special teams guy. And then you have a lot of American rookies here, starting with Jalen Edwards Cooper. He played at Division II school, Texas A&M Commerce. So not Texas A&M, Texas A&M Commerce. And then Keontae Harden attended Pittsburgh State for 3 years. Tyvis Powell went to Ohio State, and despite being undrafted in 2016, he actually managed to stick around the NFL until 2019. So decent amount of pro track record there. Nadir Roos played college football at West Chester University and spent 2019 training camp with Green Bay. We'll see if there's anything there. And then Bajir Wilson played in college at Liberty and attended 2020 training camp with Arizona. Again, a lot of question marks there. And then you have Jamie Harry, the last Canadian guy in this defensive back room, a University of Ottawa product going into his second CFL season in 2021 after only dressing for a single game during 2019 as a rookie. So we'll see if there's anything there. But I think this secondary has a really good 5-man unit with a lot of experience, and I think they could potentially find a gem. They've been pretty good at developing defensive back prospects over the past few years, so I'm really interested to see what comes out of all these rookies here, but I just have so much trust with those top 3 defensive backs in this unit to make plays for this defense and be one of the best units in the CFL this season. Now moving on to special teams, they could rank 9th in the CFL, and I said this a lot in previous videos. There are a lot of situations in the league that the kicking situation is kind of up in the air, and this is the main example of it. You have Stefan Flintoff, Takuru Namasaki, and Jake Ford all competing for the kicking duties here. I don't know if they're a team that's going to split up the duties and have a separate punter and a kicker, but usually the case is if there's an American being the kicker, they usually do both jobs. But if it's a Canadian kicker, which they don't really have on the roster here, they usually can keep 2 guys. So we'll see who wins that punting job. Jake Ford was actually their #1 pick in the CFL Global Draft this year. If you can believe, a punter went 1st overall. So we'll see if he makes the roster here. He's probably the Global they keep, if I had to take a guess, just because he was such a high draft pick. I just don't know what's going to happen when that kicking situation is completely up in the air, and there's not even a guy with a hint of CFL experience, so we'll see what happens. And then Tanner Dahl, your long snapper here, and Chris Rainey and Lucky Whitehead, pretty good return options. Rainey has been a very effective return man throughout his CFL career. It's kind of what he's known for. Was pretty effective in 2019 with Toronto. And then Lucky Whitehead, another guy that's mostly known for his kick return ability. I don't know how much he's going to do with, like I said early in the video, with more of his transition to offense. So we'll see how he does. But like I said, I'm just really excited to see how that kicking situation works itself out. Now moving on to our projected starters on the offensive side of the ball for BC. I think 4 guys in the receiving core are locks, with Johnson, Burnham, Rhymes, and Durant. All guys that have proven themselves at the CFL level. But that 5th wide receiver spot is up for grabs. I'm going to put Lucky Whitehead in there for now because they brought him in. He was a big offseason addition. But there's no guarantee of a roster spot there, at least in the starting lineup. There's also the possibility of them starting 3 Canadian receivers, which would be crazy, but it's possible with Javon Catoy being a legitimate 3rd option there. So I'm really interested to see what they do with that 5th wide receiver spot. And then on the offensive line, your tackles are set. Suk Chung is for sure going to start with how much they're paying him. And then Hunter Stewart, he's going to start in this offense because he's the most experienced lineman, I think, out of their Canadian guys. But I'm not too sure where exactly he's going to start. He's maybe a left guard. But I think with the release of Philip Norman this week, who is a center prospect for this group, I think he's going to start at center. I think it's possible that Peter Godber also plays at center, but I just don't trust him to be a full-time starter, so I'm going to put Hunter Stewart there at the center position. And then at left guard, I put an American rookie there in Jarrell Broxton. I'm not too confident in that, but the reason for this is because of the ratio situation. With the way it worked out, it's, CFL teams only have to start 7 Canadians, and it's very rare that they start more than that, even though BC actually has a lot of Canadian depth at a lot of spots. And it's also pretty rare that CFL teams start less than 3 Canadian offensive linemen. But in this case, I actually do have them starting only 2 Canadian offensive linemen because they actually have a lot of depth elsewhere, and we'll talk about that on defense. This offense looks pretty darn good on paper. I just think that they really need to sort out that interior of that offensive line, and if they can improve drastically in that, they will be a very good offense this season, with Michael Riley hopefully having a big bounce back season this year. Now on defense, there are a lot of questions, and they're actually right down the middle. So it's anybody's guess who's going to start at those defensive tackle spots. I just kind of plugged in 2 names, 2 guys that are listed as defensive tackles on the BC Lions roster. So we'll see what happens there, but I don't have too much faith that Josh Banks or Afumba is going to be the guy that starts at the defensive tackle spots for this team. So we'll see what happens there, who they're going to roll out there on opening day. And then Jordan Williams, I think he's going to start, but I could also see a guy like Bo Lacombo starting at that middle linebacker spot because he's more experienced. But I think Jordan Williams, because he was such a high draft pick and has the potential, I think they want to get him on the field basically right away for this team. And Isaiah Gozalek-Messam, a guy that I think is going to for sure start in this defense. I think because he was actually really coming on near the end of the 2019 season that he's going to be a guy that they're really going to try to build around this linebacking core. Chaffee, obviously a starter there at strong side linebacker. But then you have the big question at safety. Who's going to start there? Anthony Thompson, or I think I could see Boseka Lukambo being moved back to safety from the linebacking core to start there. I'm really interested to see how this team works itself out with those question marks. But I think the defensive back room really well set. Like I said, with those big four names. Otherwise, I think just the questions in this defense are just right up the middle. Now, moving on to the team award predictions. For most outstanding player, I have Brian Burnham, the wide receiver. I think he's the best player on this team, easily. He's just such a well-rounded player, and I think he's going to have a big season, just like he did in 2019. And then most outstanding defensive player, I have TJ Lee, the defensive back. I think he's one of the most well-rounded defensive backs in the CFL. He can play a little physical for you. He can play excellent coverage. He can take the ball away. So I think he's in for a big year, and I think he's the best player on this defense. And then most outstanding Canadian, I have Lamar Durant at wide receiver. I think there are a lot of different ways you can go. You can probably go with a linebacker here. You can go with an offensive lineman. But I'm going with Lamar Durant because I think he's a very good receiver, and I think this receiving core, they're going to put up some big numbers this year, and I think Durant is going to be a big benefactor of that. And then most outstanding offensive lineman, I have Riker Matthews. I think he's going to get a ton of credit if this team drastically improves their offensive line play this season. I just think that because he was the big change that they saw from the 2019 unit, if he's able to lock up that one tackle spot, he's going to be very much appreciated by this team. So he's probably going to get the nomination if he plays well this season. And then most outstanding rookie, again, my most outstanding rookie predictions are pretty well a joke, but I actually do feel pretty confident in this one. I think Jake Ford wins that kicking job, at least as a punter, as that global player who's the first pick in the draft. And I think he wins the Rookie of the Year award because he's actually going to play a ton for this team. So those are my team award predictions for the season. And then moving on to my final thoughts about the BC Lions going into the 2021 CFL season. So the key question is, are the offensive line issues behind the Lions? And this is the question that a lot of people are wondering about this team, the observers, the fans, everybody that's interested in this team is wondering, can they solve that offensive line that was terrible in 2019? I have my questions and I have my doubts, like I said throughout this video, but I do think it has slightly improved, especially with Riker Matthews coming over. So I think they partially solved it, but I don't know if it's enough for them to get over the hump this season. And that leads me to my general prediction is that in the stacked Western Division, I think they're likely missing the playoffs again. I just like the rosters of a lot of the other teams better in this division. But, I mean, trying to predict the CFL this season is kind of a joke anyway. It's just really hard to predict it with the whole year off, all this player movement. So we'll see how all these teams do this season. And BC is one of the most fascinating teams to predict. I actually made a video a while back saying that they actually are the hardest team to predict going into this season because they actually do have an elite quarterback, they have really elite playmakers, and they actually have a pretty good secondary as well, which are all things that I consider pretty crucial aspects to being a successful football team. But they're also a team that's not very physical at the line of scrimmage on either side of the ball, so we'll see how it plays out this season. But I would like to know your thoughts about this team in the comments section. And with that said, that is going to be the end of today's video, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to thank each and every one of you for watching. Once again, my name is Jason. If you want to support the show, the best way to do it is by hitting that like button and subscribing to Aussie Settle for more CFL content just like this. I appreciate all the support, and with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Peace!